In this lecture, I'll discuss traditional food revitalization on the Tohono Nation, which is in Arizona. I will be referencing some of the work that I conducted on the Tohono Reservation, and particularly from the Continuity and Change article that you have available on Bolt from 2008. The overall outline of the presentation is as follows. First, I'll talk about some of the data collection methods, as well as some of the issues with data collection on the Tohono Nation. I'll talk about Tohono geography and economy generally in order to give you a background of the information in the area. I'll also talk about how traditional foods were defined by Tohono individuals, a larger discussion of food systems, some of the factors which are limiting consumption of traditional foods, and some of the things that Tohono individuals suggested could be done in order to promote traditional food security, and indeed some of the continuing work that's being done by local organizations. In terms of data collection, there was a long process for permission and approval. At the time, there was not an institutional review board or IRB on the Tohono Nation. The process entailed me going between each of the 11 districts and seeking permission from each of the districts, and sometimes at the community level, to conduct research. I then went to the Legislative Council and presented my research plan as well as the approval letters from some of the districts, but not all of them. And it was subsequently, after a little bit of a process, approved by the Tohono Legislative Council. In terms of recruitment sites and methods, I utilized recruitment sites in the San Lucie District, Santa Fe District, Sells District, particularly the Sells Community, and Choctaw District. I also had permission to conduct research in Pacific, but I did not get to do too much of the research in that actual area. Overall, I also engaged in participant observation, which was anything from worked at an allied health college at the time and worked with massage therapy students, and we ended up going out to several of the events on the Tohono Nation and performed massage for things like fun runs and diabetes health fair to increase the idea of wellness outside of biomedical context as a whole. In terms of formal interviews, I also formally interviewed 55 individuals who had done work with food systems overall in the area, particularly 48 Tohono individuals that were interviewed between July 2004 and December 2006. The Tohono Nation is located along the U.S.-Mexico border, and you can see here, this is about 70 miles here, that the Tohono Nation shares with essentially the U.S.-Mexico border. Indeed, like many Indian nations today in the United States, we see a decrease in the overall size of the lands from the historic occupation of Tohono individuals. Nevertheless, this remains a core area of O'odham individuals. To get a sense of the scale, you can see the map by Ken Mattson here on your right. Gives you an idea of the scale. Overall, it's about the size of the state of Connecticut. There are also O'odham that exist in Mexico. There are about 1,000 O'odham that exist in Mexico today, and many of these individuals have access to health care through Indian Health Services in the United States as they're enrolled members of a federally recognized Native nation or Indian nation in the United States. We also see here on the map, geographically, the center of the nation, at least in terms of politics, as well as in terms of a lot of the information economy going on, is in Sells. Around 4,000 or 5,000 individuals here. It's named after Cato Sells, former head of the BIA. It takes about an hour to drive out to Sells from Tucson. And again, this is also the location, at the time I did my research, of the only grocery store on the Tohono Nation as a whole. Today, the Tohono Nation utilizes many sources of revenue. Probably the most prominent and sometimes controversial of these is the casino. There's also been historic mining in the area on the nation. There's been quite a widespread use of mining in the area. You can see some evidence of this with old placer mines, old exploratory pits, and even in some areas old railroad grades where mining was done on the nation. Ranching, historically, the nation was divided up along those 11 districts, the 11 districts of the nation, the 9 contiguous districts, along the lines of ranching districts. In terms of agricultural production, there have been government projects which have focused on the development of the Tohono towards the line of agricultural production, mostly for export economy. On 2 of those farms, the Sanavir Cooperative Farm as well as Papago farms, there's been more of a recent transition to more traditional foods and supplying local O'odham individuals with traditional foods as a whole. As I mentioned earlier, professional administrative tasks are a big focus in cells. They are a primary source of employment in the center of the nation, in cells. There's also the informal economy, which exists on the Tohono Nation, and this has to do with transnational flows of both people and goods. Some estimates have migrants moving through the Tohono Nation at about 1,500 per day on the nation at any one time. This can potentially contribute to personal income, with coyotes who will assist in the movement of these individuals across the U.S.-Mexico border to Tucson, Phoenix, and then points beyond. There are also some estimates that suggest about 1% of those individuals moving across the border are involved in some form of drug smuggling, and there are already reports in Arizona Daily Star and other magazines and newspapers that account for a fairly widespread movement of illegality, drugs, as well as people across the border as a whole. According to one estimate, the cost of the Tohono Nation of this movement of people and goods is about $5 million as of 2005 for health care, as well as border enforcement overall. Increasingly, the borders become militarized in a lot of the other regions, and this has focused a lot of the push or a lot of the migration out of places like out of the San Diego region as well as El Paso region. Now you see a lot more movement through the desert, and this, of course, is a great risk to individuals for potentially dying from dehydration, as well as in winter months dying from exposure to the elements of the cold. There are many traditional food groups on the Tohono Nation that promote traditional foods. The Sanavir Cooperative Farm, Tohono Community Action, the Healthy O'odham Promotion Program, and the Tohono Community College, as well as Native Seed Search, which is not a native organization, but was started in 1983 with the idea of preserving agrobiodiversity or crop genetic diversity, and particularly traditional food varieties of native nations in the Southwest as well as Sonora, Mexico. In terms of thinking about traditional foods, we might define these along the lines of pre-contact foods. However, O'odham individuals that I spoke with identified both pre-contact foods, Spanish, Mexican, or missionary foods, and U.S. or commodity foods as comprising of traditional foods as a whole. And this became problematic in the overall definition of traditional foods. The names that I use here are pseudonyms of the geographic and relative age and gender of the individuals specified. And you can read through these quotes. Ernie here notes that a real struggle to define what exactly constitutes traditional O'odham foods in the context of identity both from Mexico as well as O'odham. And so how is it actually classified? Is the food more Mexican? Is it more O'odham in nature? On the other hand, Lionel from Cook District notes that, well, when do we actually define the time that is traditional? And so this is the idea of trying to put a strict time boundary on when tradition happened. And indeed, tradition is something that changes over time, and this was fairly evident in contemporary elder and young adult perceptions of traditional foods. You can see here from this relative percentage that young adults were much more frequently mentioning things like fry bread or popovers, potato salad, tortillas or chimit, red chili, and squash and cheese as traditional foods in comparison to elders. Young adults are that percentage of the population, and this was an arbitrary classification by me, between 20 and 39 years of age. Elders would be those 60 and above. On the other hand, elders were much more frequently likely to mention things like cholla buds, prickly pear, bayadach, temporary beans, mesquite, and corn in relation to young adults as a whole. In the larger context of why this matters in terms of world problems and issues, we can see that reliance on particular food systems also creates reliance on particular resources, amongst these water. And in Arizona, a state which is fairly well known for its issues of water shortage, we can see that a large part of Arizona agriculture requires heavy use of water with the production of cattle and calves, dairy products, lettuce, cotton, as well as hay. These, of course, generate a tremendous amount of revenue. At the same time, they put an incredible amount of source on what is increasingly groundwater for utilization of crops and growing crops. The Otham food system has, of course, changed over time. Today, individuals participate in gathering both through organizations as well as families, and production occurs through organizations as well as families and at the community level as well. The Otham food system has changed quite a bit over time. We can see a clear shift from floodwater farming in the 1910s all the way up to 2003, where we see a major shift to irrigation groundwater. And this reliance, of course, ties into the overall dependence on water and the drawing down of aquifer and underground resources of water, which are not renewable at the extent to which they're being withdrawn today. In terms of the Otham food system, in terms of sales, many of the traditional food groups participate in sales. Tohono O'odham Community Action is amongst those who operate Papago farms, who are advertising outside the general area. And here you can see some of the packaging that occurs there. There's a lot of information on here for outsiders that aren't necessarily familiar with the food compared to the Santa Vera cooperative farm, which has much more plain packaging, and you would have to actually know how to be able to cook these foods and what they actually do. There's been quite a bit of transition over time in terms of the cost of traditional foods, in terms of both availability and marketing. For some traditional foods, such as temporary beans, you see a decrease of the cost of these foods due to increased mechanization in agriculture and decreased use of labor. On the other hand, you see increasing cost of traditional foods as these foods move outside of the nation as well, both with choya buds and sitol syrup. Now, production is one part of the issue here. The other part is consumption of said traditional foods. And this is from a study that was done by Tohono O'odham Community Action as well as Tohono O'odham Community College in 2002. And I found very similar results. And indeed, people were being able to access less traditional foods than they actually wanted to. So there was still a gap in what I found in my research. There was still a gap some 5-6 years later in terms of what was wanted versus what people were actually having access to. And so some of the solutions that people were tossing around had to do with some of the factors that limited traditional consumption overall. People were still having issues finding it, their transportation and distance, which can be related to it being hard to find. Some pointed out that it was too expensive, or that it took too much time in order to prepare a lot of these foods. I'd imagine that if I would have done more of my work on the southern part of the Tohono O'odham Nation, safety would have become a greater concern with the U.S.-Mexico border as a whole. Some of the overall suggestions, the biggest thing was education. People on the O'odham Nation really pushed for education, both from elders as well as in institutional settings, to promote traditional foods, to know about their importance, how to prepare them, and how they fit in overall, particularly with a focus on transmission of information from elders to young adults as well as children in schools. Most of the recent work has focused on the development of traditional foods, not only production but also distribution and exchange. And this has occurred with small-scale gardening and farming that occurs in cells, as well as preparation of traditional foods and ready-made meals. I want to thank at this point many of the individuals that helped me to understand traditional foods a lot better, individuals on the Tohono O'odham Nation. Much of the work was supported later on by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, but much of the organizations on the Tohono O'odham Nation as well, particularly TOCA, Tohono O'odham Community College, and Santa Vera Cooperative Farm. Many of the district councils that also supported my research over time as well. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to post those on Blackboard, or on Bolt, and I'll look forward to hearing